David, thank you very much indeed for coming to Innovex at Lancaster University Management School. I know you must have an incredible agenda right now with it being Olympic year and the Sky team racing all over the world, so thank you indeed.
Pleasure, pleasure.
What we're going to do today is to talk about innovation from the normal analysis we do on commercial companies based on innovation on the business model, on product, on process and on service, and use that analysis on what you're doing to create such incredible performances in cycling GB. So first of all, I'd like to look at your own personal background, family and so on. I know your father was quite innovative and created the Moac nut and designed the Kerber ice axe.
So, I remember it well.
I just wanted to make that clear because we're talking to a mountaineering audience, of course. But he was from the steel industry, and it was a very disciplined man and taught students. He changed into teaching, and he taught students for many years. And he was known as a very good teacher, but meticulous in his detail and requirements. Are you conscious that you've inherited any of that from the background?
I certainly think I grew up with in and around a very strong work ethic, and this idea to change. I can remember well that we grew up in this house in the middle of nowhere in Wales, and he had a forge at the back of the house, and there'd forever be guys from Sheffield turning up for the weekend to go climb at Llanberis Pass, and they'd all come up with their ice axes, which were straight at the time, and he'd be forging them to be bent because obviously the angle of attack seemed to be improved if you bent apparently that you bent it, and then they'd be taking the two front forks of or two front prongs of the crampons and angling them. That was the next big thing, and then we had this telegraph pole outside the house, and you used to get these guys in the middle of summer running up and down with ice axes and crampons to this telegraph pole just to prove that the theories worked, And I think that somehow that rubbed off. He had a massive work ethic, and always talked about being professional, always talked about what it meant to be on time, work hard, and I guess that stuck with me, to be honest.
That's really wonderful to hear that ethic of work, and also the trial and error, trying to make things work better, to get things working better. Can we have a look now at your education and the pathway you went?
Yeah, well, I grew up in North Wales, I've just said, and I didn't particularly like school. I liked sport, but as far as the more still classic academic lessons went, I could do it. I mean, I knew that I could do it, but I didn't enjoy it at all. And all I could think of was getting out of school. I felt very confined. I didn't like the hours and the constraint of it all, and I just wanted to break free. So I left when I was 16. I in the back of my head, I knew that at some point I'd have to have some further education, but I just wanted to get out there and work. So I started off as an apprentice draftsman in the local county council in their highways department, and soon after that, I started a day release course, and I did an ONC, then an ONC and an HNC in civil engineering. And the day that I qualified with my HNC in civil engineering, it was a higher national certificate at the time, I quit my job and decided to go and race my bike in France. And again, that was another sort of breaking out of thing and going to get this freedom and go and chasing my dreams. So I raced my bike for a few years. I lived full time in France in Saint-Etienne, and during that time got passionately interested in sports nutrition, sports physiology, sports performance, sports psychology, and that led me then to once I realised I wasn't going to win the Tour de France after all. I decided, right, I need to get my education sorted out. So I came back to Britain and started a course in sports science psychology. It was John Moore's university degree, but I did it at Chester, which was great. And then after that, I wanted to pursue a career in sports psychology, really. But at the time, the industry didn't seem to be well established. The career pathway wasn't clear. I wasn't too sure whether it was actually becoming an accepted part of the sports industry or not. So I started working in the cycling industry, and then I thought, well, I want to give myself more education, and so I decided that actually an MBA would be the way to go, and give myself some business background and knowledge. So hopefully somewhere down the line I could combine everything that I've got into into a career. So off I went to Sheffield Business School, and I spent 2 years doing an MBA there, which I thoroughly enjoyed. So I think from an educational point of view, the timing was right for me. I wanted to learn. I was at the phase in my life where I had a desire, and I just had a thirst for information. Whereas when I was younger, I wasn't at the right time. And going to do A levels and going down the classic route for me, I think would have been a big mistake. I don't think I'd have completed it. Not because I couldn't do it, but because I wasn't in the right space or frame of mind at the time. So I was a bit of a late starter, but it served me well.
Very interesting and quite inspirational, David. I'd like to move on now to the very first type of innovation. There are 4 types. The business model, product innovation then, and service and process innovation. But the business model is what creates the cash inflows into any business, and your business, if you like, I can call it that, needs those cash inflows. But there's one thing that strikes me before we just touch on those cash inflows, is that as I look and take the long view of the industry over, say, the last 40 or 50 years, I can see that there's been many great all-time cyclists, and when they finished their career, their experience wasn't able to be brought back into the field, either because there wasn't funds there or because there just wasn't a system to work that. Whereas what you seem to have created is a system where you can bring back those best practices and build on them. Can we start from that point?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there is no doubt about it from a business model perspective. If we look at all of the summer and winter Olympic sports, the catalyst and the defining moment for change was the introduction of the National Lottery funding for sports, late 1997, late 1997, early 1998. All of a sudden, what had been a very amateur industry insofar as all the governing bodies, so the British Cycling Federation, for example, didn't have the revenue, didn't have the income to fund full-time coaches, any research and development, all of that sort of area. It was done on a volunteer basis, likewise for most of the other Olympic sports. However, overnight, each sport had the opportunity to put a business plan together and bid for lottery funding. And from, in British Cycling's case, it had a turnover, I think at the time, of about £350,000 a year. And its first lottery grant was close on £2 million. So you can imagine the magnitude of change that created, the step change that created, was massive. And that allowed a whole new business model to be developed along the lines then of creating a full-time professional staff to focus on excellence and trying to move excellence within cycling forward. So it definitely an innovation by whoever came up with the lottery concept that really was revolutionary, and still is proving to be nearly 14 years later.
Nevertheless, the key to it is still your business model within British Cycling, which has produced that success, because you have to bid competitively for the money, and that's created such a huge success. You told us your start budget. Where are you at now on budget terms? Is that something you can share with us?
It's increased quite substantially. We've also got commercial sponsorship now, which we didn't have when we started off. So we're in around the for the next the 4-year cycle is in and around 28 million revenue over the 4 years. So it's a substantial operation now. But coming back to your earlier points, I think what that allows us then to do is let me start again. I think coming back to your earlier point, hold on a second. You can cut this out, presumably, can't you, and edit it? So our revenue now is in and around the £28 million for a 4-year Olympic cycle. And of course, coming back to your earlier point, what that allows us to do is to go out and look at hiring the best people in certain areas and bring back in expertise from the sport and from competitors who've been in the sport, Chris Boardman being a brilliant example, but also go worldwide and look at the global market to make sure that we're bringing in the best experts in relevant fields.
That's really interesting, thank you. Could we move forward now into the next area on product innovation? Things have moved quite considerably since you mentioned when you were racing professionally. I think you were using a steel 753 frame. You hit a rabbit, I remember.
I've got the scars to show it.
I bought the repaired bike from your dad, and it was a very nice bike at that time. But can you just take us through what's been happening in innovation? Because we know that you have reputedly all sorts of secret workshops all over the place making bicycle parts that you cover up. You try not to see anybody see any pictures.
That's right.
Take any pictures. You cover them over as soon as they've been used on the track. You cover them over with cloths and so on. Could you take us through that?
Certainly. I think we've just come back. Literally, just got back 3 days ago from the World Championships in Australia. And it's quite interesting that both the Australian team and German teams were actually riding on their full 2012 Olympic kit, whereas we've decided not to ride in our 2012 kit until the Olympics. And that's the kind of level that it's got to now. So you have plainclothes people, going around photographing everybody's equipment, and the Australians came in and filmed our every single training session prior to the actual championship starting, which kind of gives you a sense of the level of inquisition that's going on to try and move things forward. But from an innovation point of view, obviously there's two things at play here, which is quite interesting. One is that there's the bike industry itself, which continuously tries to improve and strive for innovation in terms of efficiency and new technologies, in terms of materials, stiffness, lightweight bikes, etc. However, I think the interesting point from our perspective is that that's very much driven by the end user financial willingness to buy. So I think it's capped in terms of the actual value and innovation that's being driven by the actual the consumer industry, if you like. Whereas on a kind of different scale, what we were interested in as a British track cycling team at the time, we looked around to see what the best bikes were, and we kind of left a bit dissatisfied. So we thought, right, okay, well, why don't we make our own bikes? And of course, our approach was completely performance driven. We wanted to create the best bikes, and all of our R&D and expenditure was going to go into 26 bikes basically. And if our bikes cost £5,000–6,000 each to build, we could justify that. We could probably build that at a cost price. If you then went to retail those bikes, they'd probably retail at 15–20,000. So the consumer market, if you like, that was beyond the reach of most manufacturers. So we were kind of in this unique position where we could create these ridiculously expensive one-offs nearly, which would drive performance, which we couldn't persuade the industry to do because they didn't see it as a commercially viable project. So we managed to bring in quite a unique designer. There's a Greek guy. He was a carbon fibre engineer. He was working in a company, in an aerospatial company down in Nottinghamshire, a place called Hena, just outside Nottingham. He's a UCI commissaire to boot, so he knew all the rules and regulations. And we put him together with Chris Boardman and Peter Keane at the time, who drove this project, and deserves a lot of credit for that. And they got together and they started looking at what would the best possible track bike look like, and that then started the thought processes of, well, why are we going to stop at the frame? Why don't we look at the wheels? Why don't we look at the package of the entire bike? And where that led us was to quite a quick realization that in cycling, there are very specialist, there are guys who specialize in handlebars, there are guys who specialize in, Mavic make wheels, for example. You'd have your seat post manufacturers, you have your frame builders, and you'd have different, pedal manufacturers. And when you sort of brought all the best bits and put it all together, it wasn't necessarily the case that the gains from each one of the individual components aggregated together to make an overall gain. And of course, we soon realised that you have, from an aerodynamic point of view, that you have to look at the whole package.
It's really incredibly interesting, because the analogy there that we would use is the analogy between what's called the Wintel, where we're sat in front of a computer now, and the so-called Wintel platform between Windows and Intel was driven by ensuring that all the components work together and not separately. So it's a very interesting analogy. Sorry, carry on.
Yeah, well, I think that that led us then to create our first batch of components, which proved successful not only from a performance perspective, not only because they were actually aerodynamically and stiffer and performed better, but it actually gave the riders a very, very big psychological boost. There's nothing better when you go on the start line of an Olympic final or Olympic Games or any major competition to think that you are on something better, or at least as good as anybody else in the competition. So I think whether that's a placebo effect or a genuine measurable effect, I think it's very, very powerful. So we actually then decided we'd keep pushing this and started to expand that part of the whole operation. And then I think the next step really was in looking at performance and how to achieve excellence in humans, we came up with this concept that actually, rather than looking for a step change in one particular area, we would try and pursue small gains. If you looked at everything that impacted on a performance in a cycle race, and you could improve everything by a small margin, and you then put all of that together and aggregated it together, you would actually get quite a significant increase. So rather than going down the route of looking for the one big idea, we decided that actually what we're going to do is going to go after everything, which is a pretty full-on approach, and you needed a team of people who were going to buy into that and be willing to work in that way. But that was then the philosophy, that was the idea, and off we went. So we looked at pretty much everything.
You touched briefly on the word psychology. We're going to come to that in a moment later, but I'd like to just try and spotlight one particular example. My friends and I were enthralled by seeing the Paris-Nice race, and we were watching on the final time trial, and Wiggins was there with a 6-second lead, I think, and he won it with 8 seconds.
Yeah.
And from our basic knowledge, we could see that Wiggins was riding to the clock with using all his time trial experience, but the Dutchman Wiestra just seemed to be, what we said, going for it. But Wiggins wasn't, because there was a lot of uphill climbing, he wasn't using his time trial bike and some of the time trial things. Can you just give us a little insight as to what you did there in terms of ensuring that?
Yeah, and again, I think this is over a series of, a number of years. There was quite a lot going on for that final time trial, which basically decided the race. It was a very tough time trial. It was at the Col d'Aix, which basically has the first, it goes straight into a hill, which is 8%. It flattens out to 3 or 4% in the middle for a couple of K, and then it finishes with a ramp of 8% again, and then flattens out to the finish. So it's quite a difficult time trial to ride, because if you spend too much at the bottom, you're going to really pay for it on the second section. So it's a question of really being able to spread your efforts over the whole thing. And the other thing that came into play there, we use a lot of what's called SRM data, which is we record power through strain gauges in the cranks, so we get everybody's power data related to speed, etc., etc. And so we could actually predict and create a little model for Bradley as to how best he could ride that particular course and distribute his power and energies to go fastest from A to B. Off the back of that, he's become very, very good at that as well. He's very, very attuned now to how to empty the tank over the whole course. So we were talking his language, and he certainly buys it. So we had a model that was coming out of the numbers, as it were. And then when you looked at it, of course, one of the key challenges in an uphill time trial is gravity. Whereas normally if it's on a flat, it's aerodynamics, it's the air, it's actually punching a hole through the air, which is the biggest challenge. But of course on this course there was a mix between what's going to cost us the most time is actually the aerodynamics of travelling about 34 k an hour uphill, 32, 34 k an hour, or is it actually the gravity, the mass that's going to be the problem, the biggest problem for Bradley. So we had a few issues around how to get the bike to be as light as possible. Should you use a time trial bike with with aerodynamic tri-bars? Should you use the heavier aerodynamic helmet, or would you be better off with a lighter road helmet, which is less aerodynamic, but the mass was less? So we crunched a lot of numbers prior to this time trial to see, and we went in the end with a kind of a hybrid bike, which is road bike, but we then went with this marginal gains philosophy, which was we took the tape off the handlebars, we put little tri-bars on so he could get into his lower position, and they changed his bearings to ceramic bearings. They did everything that they could to get this bike to be as light as possible. And then we crunched the numbers on aerodynamic or mass, and it actually came out just in favour of aerodynamic helmet. And I think that's the kind of gives you a bit of insight into the level now that we can scrutinise and look for innovation in certain key race winning moments.
That's quite amazing, but I noticed that you were using a mathematical algorithm, but presumably at some point you start way back at the wind tunnel, and your facility is wind tunnel facilities.
Yeah, we spend a lot of time in, over the years we've spent a huge amount of time in Southampton wind tunnel, and Chris Boardman and the team have been in there for hours on end developing different products and testing. And of course one of the key things is the position of the rider on the bike. As I mentioned a minute ago, the key challenge we face is punching a hole through the air, and it's amazing how many bike riders, professional bike riders, will say, oh, I need a narrower tyre section, I need a narrower frame and more aerodynamic frame, but they're quite happily sitting bolt upright. And basically if they tilted their heads down, the difference that position to that position makes is way more advantageous than any width of tyre or any width of wheel or type of wheel. And so we do a lot of positional analysis in the wind tunnel now to try and get the riders to be as aerodynamic positionally as possible. Now, in order to do so, you have to tilt the hips quite dramatically, and it's an uncomfortable position for a rider to be in. And we couldn't get the rider to buy in at all. So we like to work on this idea of ownership. So we came up with this concept, and coming back to the idea of psychology, came up with the concept of beaming onto the floor via a projector the real time data that the guys were reading and collecting whilst the riders were in the wind tunnel. So we actually put the the aerodynamic drag figure that was being created in real time on the floor in front of the riders so they could see it, and we translated that into how much that would gain them over X amount of kilometres at X speed an hour. And so they could see, the number of seconds that they would gain over a period if they rode in this position against this position. So rather than sort of having the coaches saying, we really need to adopt this position, and the riders going, well, I don't feel great, I'm sure I lose power, it feels uncomfortable, I'm not convinced. As soon as they saw the numbers themselves in front of them on the floor, the potential gains they could make, off they were going themselves to the physio and saying, look, come on, you need to help me give these exercises, tilt my hips forward. What are you playing at? Why are you waiting? And I think that's the power of ownership, and I think that's critical in innovation, that people, the end user, can see the benefit of some of the work or the time and effort required to make improvements.
Finally, just one final comment now, before we move to the next innovation subject. UCI regulations. Any quick comments there? I noticed Chris Boardman was interviewed a few days ago.
Yeah.
About how he has an interface with UCI.
Yeah. Well, I think initially the UCI rules were very much based. How can I put it politely? They follow trends and they react to trends, as against having a master plan, if you like. What does the sport look like in 5-10 years' time? What's the role of technology to develop the sport in 5 years, 10 years? And I think what tends to happen is a bit like the O'Brien-Boardman scenario, where Graham O'Brien adopted the ski position when he turned up with his washing machine bike and had his arms tucked in, and it just didn't look right. It didn't look like a cycling position, and therefore the UCI banned it for no reason. There's no logical reason for banning it. And then he went down the safety route and all the rest of it. And then you had the Superman position, where everybody basically lay more or less forward on the bike, and immediately that got banned. And we see a lot of reactive kind of banning and rules introduced by the UCI. There's obviously a safety element, and one of the key things that manufacturers trying to do is trying to bring the weight of the bike lower and lower and lower. And of course, then there is a compromise between the strength and rigidity and therefore safety of a bike. So they introduced a minimum weight of 6.8 kilograms for a bike, which I think is fair. So we're all limited by that. However, a lot of the bikes now have to be, every bike's measured before, weighed before, particularly at the Olympics before key competitions, and we have to add ballast to some of the bikes to bring them up to weight.
And some of the ballast is sometimes a power meter.
Yeah, the power meter, is heavier than the power cranks and heavier than the normal cranks, and there's a battery as well. So, that does add weight to the overall mass of what we're trying to shift. But I think, excuse me, the key, with the UCI is there have been rules for quite some time, but now the application of those rules is becoming far more rigid, and that's what we're now seeing. So one could argue that given if everybody plays within the rules as they currently stand and the rules are applied fairly, that the opportunity for getting major advantages from design and material design of bikes, we're actually getting to that point of diminishing returns now. I think the major gains have been made, and it's becoming smaller and smaller and smaller as time goes on, unless there's a new major breakthrough, ready to happen. Who knows?
Okay, thank you for the product overview. Could we move on now to what we might refer to as service innovation in terms of, the sports psychology? And you talked not long ago about belief systems when you were interviewed after the 2012 World Track Championships.
Well, I think psychology is massive, but we all know it is, and when
we don't necessarily all know it is. Lewis Hamilton was quoted, the F1 driver was quoted a few months ago as saying he'd rather die than use a sports psychologist.
You don't have to use a sports psychologist. I think there's a difference between the psychology of performance and using a sports psychologist. I think people make a mistake when they naturally assume, thinking about the mental, what does the mind do in performance? Doesn't necessarily have to mean you need to go and see a sports psychologist. And I think when I talk about psychology, it's about how do you understand, or do we understand what happens to the mind under severe stress or anxiety or within the competition environment, and can that be improved? Our approach to this has been interesting, I think. I was very fortunate to meet a guy called Dr. Steve Peters, who's the undergraduate dean at Sheffield School of Medicine. He was actually working at Rampton High Security Hospital, prison, whatever it is, when I met him, and he was working with psychopaths and murderers, and he came over and helped us out, and translated beautifully into sport, which was quite a worry, but there we go. But the thing that Steve's a psychiatrist, not a psychologist, and big difference. I think the psychiatrist has been medically trained for 7 years. Psychologist obviously hasn't necessarily been, he could go from a postgrad to sports psychology, whereas the medical background of a psychiatrist, I think, puts them maybe in a different aspect. And Steve came, and what I found really interesting from Steve's work is that he viewed the brain as a machine with different components. So, if you like, we're quite happy that the torso, within our torso, we've got all our different vital organs, so our lungs, our liver, and they all do different things. They all function, they all have different functions, but they all act as units within our torso to keep us going. And I think that was the analogy of the brain, really. There were different components of the brain. And if you could understand which part of the brain was controlling which aspect of behaviour, then it would give you a far greater insight into being able to manage oneself and understand what the machine's doing, as it were. So we kind of put cycling to one side and started this very passionate discussion about how to achieve excellence in humans. Irregardless of cycling, it could be anything. It could be in dentistry or law or mountaineering or any pursuit. And we came up with a few ideas, very much led by Steve's thinking. The first one was this idea of we use this acronym called the core principle. And basically that stood for, the C was for commitment. And so the difference between commitment and motivation being that, motivation we don't talk about much, really. I might feel good one day, I might not feel like doing something, I might not feel like training the next day. However, if I'm fully committed, if I'm genuinely committed, whether I really feel like it or not, won't make that much difference. I'll do it anyway. So what we're interested in sport, and particularly high-level sport, is the depth of intrinsic commitment that an individual has towards achieving a certain goal. And it's not somebody externally imposing that goal on them, they have to have that intrinsic commitment to the goal. And that could come from rewards, it could come from money, it could come from status, it could come from a personal desire to succeed. There's a whole host of different reasons why that commitment might be there, but it needs to be there. And we test for that. If it's not there, we don't start.
What you seem to be saying is you're looking for more internally driven goals rather than external.
I think so. I think externally driven goals. What the team might want to achieve and what an individual might want to achieve. Hopefully, they're the same thing. But unless an individual is genuinely internally committed, then when the going gets tough, they tend to stop or find excuses or fail. The next thing, the core principle of the O, is all about ownership. We strongly believe that human beings perform better when they're given ownership of what they're doing, some input and ownership over their behaviour.
Yes, he's given us already a remarkable insight in terms of the wind tunnel effects.
Exactly, and that that the whole idea there of projecting onto the giving the rider ownership over some of their choices. So we decided to take the crown, if you like, off the coaches' heads, and traditionally in sport it's control, command and control, dictate and control as a management method, and we tried to flip that on its head, and you thought, well, actually nobody likes to be told what to do. Nobody not many people like to be shouted at. It might get a very temporary response, but it's not a very permanent response, and not something that's going to, really invigorate individuals. So we thought, okay, we don't like the idea of, we're going to move away from the notion of bullying or passive bullying. We're going to try and give people ownership over what they're doing. We're going to try and give them a voice. We're going to try and listen to what they believe is the best way that they can develop. And they might think, well, I've done this training in the past, it didn't quite work for me that way. I responded to this, and therefore we try and work with that, negotiate. And so we really did work quite hard at trying to promote this model. Initially the coaches weren't too happy about it. What about us? If we haven't got control, then what are we going to do? And of course, it's not about having control. It's about being an expert advisor. The coaches, myself, and everybody else, we're just the minions. The people who win bike races, the bike riders, and quite often you'll hear people talking about my riders or my performance. The team is mine and I, and these are all words that we try and avoid because it's about their performance and supporting them to be the best that they can be. If there's no bike riders, I don't have a job.
So quite a lot of quite interesting changes in the relationships, which is quite important.
I'm just going to just to finish off there. I think that the counterbalance to the ownership was accountability and responsibility. It was all well and good giving somebody ownership, but unless you have accountability and responsibility, we have it in every walk of professional life. If we're salaried and we have a contract, we don't turn up to work because I've got ownership. I'll decide what I want to do. Then the consequence is I'll get fired. You know, and I think we're very strong on consequences and honesty and telling people, you know, making people accountable. But it's very different from pointing a finger and personalising and you know, bringing blame into the situation. So accountability, consequences, responsibility, very important. But we try and promote ownership within that. An example of that would be we get the riders to write their own rules. So when they come in, they write their own selection documents, and they'll write their own rules. So we don't want to be the policeman saying, you know, if you turn up late for training, well, I'll probably shout at you a little bit, I might send you home, whatever else. We actually sit down at the start and say, okay, look guys, you know, if we want you to create a set of rules, what happens if the bus is meant to be leaving for a big race, we say it's leaving at 10 o'clock and one of you is late, what do we do? And quite interesting, the riders create these rules which are far more extreme than anything that we do. And of course, once they've done it, we then commit it to paper. They all sign it off, and we have it stuck inside the team bus in Team Sky, or we have it in British Cycling, and then they then self-police. So if somebody does turn up late, we just hold these lists. So
that becomes really a core team principle.
Absolutely,
writing their own rules.
Absolutely. So it just gives you some insight into some of the psychological processes we try to develop.
Quite remarkable. It's certainly fascinating. Could we just for a moment look at sort of perhaps some of the hardware elements where you have a special Sky team bus? That's something no other teams have done, is it?
Well, they have now. They copied them.
Okay, that's good. You only know if you're a leader if people are following or copying.
True.
But can you tell us why you did that and what you think it brought?
Well, the thinking was pretty straightforward. I mean, it was quite interesting that there is no stadium for professional cycling. You know, there's the races which are traditionally along the same roads, but there's no changing room. There's no stadium, and the team bus actually becomes that place. It's where the riders have the meeting pre-race. It's how they travel to the race. It's where they get changed. It's where they come post-race, and they sit in this bus. And normally there's a long transfer. You know, something like the Tour de France. You transfer from the hotel in the morning, up early, transfer probably an hour and a half, maybe 2 hours to the start of the race. They do their race, they come back into the bus, and they transfer from there onto the next hotel, which could be up to 2-3 hours away again. So there's a lot of travelling involved. And when we looked at this, you know, at the time, the team bus seemed to be nearly like a status symbol of the team. You know, the bigger and flashier the bus, the better the team, you know. And when we started off, we were brought, we went to the most recognised team bus builder in Belgium, and they came back with a plan of a bus, and it was very traditional cycling Belgian bus, and it just seemed to miss the point. So I set our sports scientists and riders, etc., the challenge. I said, right, here's a box, an empty box, on 4 wheels, 6 wheels. What would you put in that bus? And how would you configure it if you had a white, you know, blank canvas to try and get a competitive advantage, either in getting to the race or getting from the race, in terms of our riders getting to the hotel better recovered than any other team?
So you're not sleeping on the bus?
No. Well, you can sleep on it, but no, you're not staying overnight. No.
You're not staying overnight. You're still using a hotel.
Yeah.
But the bus is there for your home and your base and your briefing. And your briefing basis on, which tidies up that very untidy gap between the start and finish.
Yeah, and so, you know, it seems obvious now, but most buses were configured, you know, with numerous seats. Some of them had showers, etc. But what came across strongly was, from a rider's point of view, was personal space. So we decided to take the first third of the bus and make that the maximum number of riders you'll ever have in a team is 9 riders. So we decided, right, how can we place 9 seats and create 9 pods, if you like, individual pods, to the highest specification, where you could have reclining seats, a bit like business class, if you like, in a flight, where you could recline a seat, have some, you know, have Wi-Fi, have your earphones, have music, have, you know, telly, skybox, whatever you want, to really be able to just relax pre and post race.
So it's a personal relaxation, first class business space.
Yes, basically, yeah. So that's what we did. We went with that. So the first third of the bus just has 9 seats and a lot of personal space. Then we have a blocked off area for showers, toilets, so there's 2 showers, so the riders can shower quickly so we can get moving. And in the back area then there's a whole meeting area. And then we put a lot of technology on the bus. We've got mobile Wi-Fi, which is quite common now, but at the time it was when it was really developing. And importantly, we put in a projector and a big screen. So pre-race now, the meetings, we use Google Earth to look at the map, look at the course. We do team presentations are done via the projector from laptops. We can put all of the information, the race data, the wind, the conditions, the road conditions are all fed in. We can send somebody to the end of a stage and they film the last 5 kilometres of a sprint stage, for example, and get all the corners so the guys can really feel, do you go left round roundabout, do you go right round roundabout, and that's then sent back to the bus and they watch that on the morning of the race. So
we've picked up a sense of this from listening to the interviews, and Mark Cavendish in particular gives an amazing interview. He's got a very good recall. He gives an interview like no one else. And he let the secrets out of the bag one day saying, yeah, we did our homework. We looked at Google Street View or something.
Yeah. And he's Mark Cavendish is good not by chance. He's good because he really does work hard at understanding the challenges of what he has to do, and then really doing his homework. And he also learns from his races. He watches them over and over again. But he does have this kind of slow motion mind, quite remarkable, where he can describe quite clearly, pretty much in slow motion, what happened, he's got great spatial awareness, what's happening around him, why he made different decisions, at what point he decided to make various decisions, which is quite remarkable.
So it's not just that he's simply fast, he's got a lot of other characteristics.
No, exactly. There's no doubt in his speed, but you need him to be at the front and use that speed wisely.
Now, road riders don't think, and mountain bike riders, for example, don't think about velodromes. Now, we've moved from a position where we had no velodromes to, is it 6 velodromes we've got now in the UK?
Well, we've got Manchester, Newport, we've got London opening, obviously open now. We've got the new velodrome in Glasgow. There's one being built in Derby, just down the road from my house, very handy.
By coincidence.
Yeah, there's one also being built, I believe, in Ireland. So it's going to give us, a whole plethora of different velodromes in different parts of the country. So the catchment areas is fantastic.
So that, at least from my perspective, seems to be starting now to become a competitive advantage, because it seems to be more than a lot of other countries have.
Certainly, and the more the better. We are limited a bit like a swimming pool. There's only so much room on a velodrome. You can only get so many riders on the track at a given time. So there is a finite number of people you can get on there. And so the catchment areas are important. But for sure, we're essentially, I would like to think anyway, we're widening the base of the pyramid from a talent perspective, particularly to young riders who will be given more chances to get into the sport.
Could we move now on to nutrition, because this is one of your areas of qualification and degree?
Yeah.
I noticed that Chester gave you an honorary PhD in nutrition, I see.
They did.
Yeah, could you take us through something there, the sort of innovation you've looked at? Because nutrition is fuel for the rider.
Key. I mean, it's absolutely key, and as we know, there's a physical challenge of, like I say, punching through the air and moving a mass. But then there's the fueling of the body and over particularly grueling time, and that's been a challenge. And there's been a lot of work done over the years with fueling, and I think it's coming full circle that now we can see riders nearly riding the entire Tour de France on gels and drink, and very few solids. But I think where the innovation has come is how to, it's the recovery, which is critical. And I think unless you can recover after every stage and fully get yourself ready for the next morning, particularly hydration-wise, then you're up against it, and you start to go on this downward spiral, and it gets worse and worse. And I think the understanding of how the body works, and management of weight loss, the big challenge, of course, in cycling is the power increases and weight decreases. So the guys want to get thinner, but want to retain power. And traditionally, as you get, you lose weight, you lose power. But now with working with the latest sort of technology and proteins and information around the more sophisticated protein diets that are now available and protein supplementation, it is possible to lose weight and retain power, as we've seen with Bradley Wiggins. A phenomenal example of somebody who's maximised their performances through maintaining power at quite drastically reduced weight.
Is it true that by dieting or some method he was able to remove weight from his upper body and still retain that power? Is that what you're saying?
That is true, and something we've done with other riders where, particularly mountain bikers, where the arm movement in mountain biking does tend to build up the shoulders and arms, and again that can be unwanted mass. So trying to reduce muscle is tricky, but we've been doing some pretty good work in that area, and it's paying good dividends.
One final question. How do you involve universities in terms of supporting research and so on?
Well, we have a team of experts who are actually employed by British Cycling or Team Sky, and then they have their own. Most of them have got academic backgrounds, obviously, and they then use their own networks and academic networks to make sure that we're outward facing towards academia and towards the latest thinking, and then their job is to get the that all the latest research and bring that and turn it around and make it inward facing to see where the application could be from a sporting perspective. I think UK Sport have done an excellent job of late, where they've now become a focal point, and they're now pulling in or working with a whole host of different, not only universities but companies, to try and pull in and pool a body of knowledge that can be used within all sports, not just particular sports. But I think the academic world is very, very important to keep your finger on the pulse. It takes time, it takes networks, it takes a thoroughness, I think, to be able to decide what latest paper is worth pursuing and what's not. I mean, that's a big decision.
The latest academic paper.
Yeah. I mean, there's obviously different schools of thought, isn't it? Research is built on debate, and innovation is built on differing views, and it's making the choice and investment decisions about what to pursue and what not to pursue, which is actually the tricky thing. There's some very clever people coming up with some very, very clever ideas out there all the time, but you can't do them all, and so I think that's where our experts have to be quite skilled in their analysis of what projects to pursue and what not.
Thank you, that's been absolutely fascinating. Can I close by saying the very best?
Thank you.
We know, of course, that nothing is left to chance,
but
some luck, sometime, is still needed.
Yeah.
So the very best for the Olympics.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Much.